Well, thank you very much for having me. I have been in Moscow now for almost a month, and I'd only been to Russia once before, a long time ago, about 12 years ago. I've had a really remarkable time. I find both the environment and the people I've met compelling. I think you face extraordinary challenges, and yet I sense a spirit of hope and enthusiasm, much as I see in my own classrooms in the United States. I'm here to talk about a topic that I spend a lot of time working on. I have two areas that I'm particularly well known for. One is that I study the way that organizations change. And I study the ways in which behaviors become rooted and are difficult to change. And most of that work is focused on studying firms and industries across locations. An industry would be like the automobile industry, or the military equipment industry, or technology industries. And my focus is on understanding why, in the presence of perfect information, when organizations know that they should change, and theory tells us that they should change, that they don't. And if the industry or the individual firm is lucky, they can resolve the conflict and start back up again and be successful. But that doesn't always happen. My other line of research interest relates to my training as a regional planner and economist. And I, from the very beginning of my graduate work, was interested in why it is that we have something called uneven development, and also why it is that some people end up in a situation in which they lack access to resources and opportunities. Theoretically speaking, from an economics perspective, if all of the underlying processes work, there really shouldn't be inequality. Or if there is, people would choose it, as opposed to having more income and more wealth. But I know you know, because you're planners, that that's not true, and that the market doesn't resolve as the only solution. And that, in fact, there are certain structural conditions that predispose individuals in certain places to lack the opportunity to either be mobile or to use their resources to improve their well-being. That work I do all the time. I think about it all the time. And I have been very interested in how the major, massive change that took place in Russia, really in the early 90s, has affected the distribution of income and opportunity. And I'm also interested in the way in which higher education, college and graduate school, enables you to do two things. One is to think about these kind of problems, because they're serious problems and they need a lot of thought. And the second is to do something about it, because you're trained as professionals to actually understand how to solve problems and how to use institutions and infrastructure to alter the experience of people's lives. So today I want to talk about poverty in America. And when I've told my friends at Skolkovo, the Moscow School of Management, and also Skolkovo Tech, that I was going to talk about this subject, they were sort of curious, because I had just given a talk on industrial development and globalization. And my students, who are mostly engineers and scientists, just evaluated my class. And although they kind of liked it, they also said, but it's social science. And what would I need social science for? So if any of them are listening, I hope they actually realize that the study of human beings and the institutions we form and the relationships we make are as important as any scientific discovery or any machine that we build. And it's only by us as that constellation of science, social science, and engineering that we will ever solve the really major problems of our time. Not engineers, not social scientists, not alone, but all of us together. And it's more important today than ever before because, in fact, scientists can add to what we know. They have special knowledge, as do engineers. But I'm confident that social scientists also have special knowledge that's valuable to engineering. So I always start my work with history. And the reason is because it's important to know what happened before you comment on what might be. So I'm going to start by explaining how it is that America even came to understand the meaning of poverty, much less articulate public policy around its management and, at different points in history, the desire to eradicate it. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we measure it, which is different than many countries do. And then I'll give you a sense of the role that geography plays in the construction of poverty and its persistence, and how one moment in history, when the stars aligned and it was possible to know what not only caused poverty, but that there were some solutions that we actually could in fact embark upon. And I'll talk about that time, and then I'll bring you up to the present. And we can talk about the present and where we are. So I usually say, because this is a relatively famous statement, I modify it a little bit, but it was said by John Kennedy in the early 1960s when he was running for president. He was sitting in a campaign office with his brother, Bobby, and he said, you know, they just came back on a bus tour from Appalachia, which is not far from Washington, D.C. And John Kennedy looked at his brother, and of course, he had this kind of interesting relationship with his brother. Well, Bobby, and he said, how can a nation that's so rich have an area in its heartland that is so poor? I think I could ask you that question at the end of the talk, and we can talk about what it's like here. But how can a nation with so much wealth and so much knowledge and infrastructure still have grinding, persistent poverty? There has never been a time in the United States history where there was not people who lacked resources and opportunities. From the very beginning when the Pilgrims came, all the way till today, never a time. But there have been moments when people have paid attention to it, and maybe it's because it's in front of them and they see it. Most of the time, for most people, poverty is invisible. You don't see the person who's sleeping in the metro station. We don't see the person who's sleeping under the freeway overpass. We don't see them. We do see them, but we don't acknowledge their existence. In the 1960s, there was a confluence of forces that brought together an interest to address the question of inequality and opportunity. And it's, as all moments of change, it's usually the result of either something cataclysmic or sometimes individual change agents. And in the early 1960s, it was change agents. So this woman right here is named Molly Orshansky. She had a PhD in economics, but because she was a woman, she couldn't get a job teaching in a university. And so she worked for the US Department of Agriculture in their food program. And one day her boss came and said, we're starting to hear out of the White House that we're going to be needing some mechanism to look at the income distribution in the country. Interestingly, Molly had already started this on her own, interested in how much it cost to live and to support a family. And so what she did is she took a number of different indicators and she studied them to try to understand their relationship to one another. And eventually she decided that the data were very imperfect. The 1960 census did not collect very specific information on a lot of factors that we would think were related to poverty. And since she was working in the US Department of Agriculture, the information she did have access to was about food and the cost of food and how much it costs to live and eat certain kinds of food and not eat other kinds of food. So she created what was called the food budget system, and in that budget system she made a scale. So normal, subnormal, really subnormal, and the bottom. And she was using that to try to show the variation in lived experience. When she made that metric, she said to the policymakers, don't use this for policy decisions. It's imperfect, and you will have it stuck. It'll become cement, like many policy ideas do, and it will impede us from addressing the problem of hunger and inequality in the country. Well, that was a great idea. Unfortunately, policymakers, as you might know, want to have an answer as soon as possible, and they often don't really want to know exactly where it came from. I can say that I've served enough policymakers that they might be mad at what I just said, but they would probably agree. So Molly created these family food budgets, and that began the formation of the American poverty policy. It was the policy that so it was a scale, right? Normal, subnormal, sub-subnormal, and bottom. Molly said, don't use the bottom. The bottom will tell you a very desperate circumstance. But for a lot of reasons, it had to do with the concern at the time in Washington, if they introduced something that made people feel like we had individuals in society who were not taking care of themselves, that it might actually stop policy from being formed. Also, they didn't want to have such a large population of people who were poor that it would become such a problem that policymakers would kill any policy designed to help them. So they picked the bottom metric. And as you can see from these statistics, in 1962, it allocated $18.60 for a family of 4 with 2 school-age children for $143 in today's dollars. Okay, so that's $30 a person a week in a family of 4. It relied on the commodity foodstuffs that we got through the Department of Agriculture: cheese, beans, rice, flour. And it really lacked a balanced diet. So there was almost no protein, and there was virtually no fresh vegetables. Luckily, for many of the poor in the United States at the time, they were just on the verge of moving off the farm. So for many people, they had gardens, so they were growing their own vegetables. Not as much were they raising animals for food. This limit, this bottom limit, as she says, it was only for emergency use and not intended to constitute a family's diet. So you all must take courses on politics, right? You're planners. You got to know everything we do is in a political environment. I want you to realize that the decisions that are made in a policy environment are not necessarily even what a policymaker wants. It's what can be sold at the time of discussion. So when Lyndon Johnson turned to Molly and said, through the Department of Agriculture secretary, come up with a metric, he knew if he made it too bad, Americans would ignore it or, get all worked up about why, but not about what or how. So he basically took a kind of low, under the radar kind of strategy, which was better than nothing, but it did actually leave a structure in place that we still live today. These are the 2013 Health and Human Services Poverty Guidelines. The basic framework of the poverty guidelines that were developed in 1960 still reside in these numbers. They have never been adjusted for the true meaning of what it costs to live. As you can see, for one person, the income that would be described as below it, you live in poverty, is $11,000. Now, I haven't done many calculations about what's the parity between Moscow and the US, and I also haven't done it for Moscow and any other city. But if you think about it, it's less than $1,000 a month. There's no expectation that this will cover health care, and as you know, we don't have national health care. It does not include in it the expectation that you're going to need emergency anything. You're going to need brand new clothes. You're going to need furniture. It doesn't include that. It includes what it would cost to rent, electricity, and food. That's what the statistic holds. So you can see for a family of 4, the poverty rate is $23,550. The median household income in the United States is $51,000. So there's a really big gap between if you're poor and if you're not. And you can see that it also doesn't increment up very much. If you have a large family, you're still trying to put people in warm clothes, in a bed, with food, for very little money. The poverty, so when Molly made the statistic, she said, okay, if you're going to use it, only use it for statistical purposes. Don't use it for policy purposes. And again, it got stuck in the narrative that was unfolding at the time, and it became the ways in which we now allocate federal supports for people that have very low income. If you are at the level of poverty in the United States, there are some additional supports. So if you register, you will get what's called food stamps, the SNAP program. It provides a family with about $50 a person a month in food stamps, and those stamps can be redeemed at a store for food and other kinds of goods that you need. The larger the family, the more you get through the policy. It's also the case that for a group of population in the country, we have a certain amount of housing subsidies that we provide. Section 8 housing, various types of public housing that's been built in individual cities. If you live in a rural place, it's very hard to get some sort of housing support, and there's almost no public housing. But those two are very important, and a third is something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. So if you're a low-income household and you make above the poverty line, but you don't make more than twice the poverty line, all the taxes that are taken out of your income over the year are given back to you at the end of the year in something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a sort of form of forced savings, which is very important, and it actually really makes a difference in families. So it has had more influence on bringing families out of poverty than anything that we've done for about 25 years. So it's a relatively new policy invention, and it has had positive consequences. It's complicated. Forced savings means you get it at the end of the year, and you might actually need it in the middle of the year, but it is a means by which, theoretically speaking, poor people can accumulate wealth. So this graphic here gives you some idea of what the relationship is between median income and the unemployment rate in the United States. So the median household income is the red line, and the, do I have that right? And the monthly unemployment rate is in the black line. And one of the things to realize is that in the US, one process that's emerged is it used to be that when we had a recession, unemployment would go up, but when the recession receded, people would get reemployed and incomes would rise again. But since the 80s, that's diverged. So there's no guarantee that as the economy recovers that we're necessarily going to see a rise in the income. And that has to do with the nature of the kind of jobs that are generated in the economy today, and the fact that a lot of Americans now have to work 2 jobs in order to make things, work. So here's an example of the government programs that keep millions out of poverty. So I've described to you the poverty, the measure, but one of the things that's really, I think, important to realize is that America has had really profound poverty alleviating policy that was extremely successful and is still successful today, and that's called Social Security. So back in the 1960s, a significant portion of the population that was really poor were the elderly, right? People that were over the age of 65, that may not have been in work where they had pensions. And so when we established the Social Security program, we literally cut the poverty rate in half. So it went from 25% to 12%. So there are programs that actually have had fundamental changes. And all this does is show you, so you can see what the poverty rate would be if we didn't have Social Security. And you can see what the poverty rate is, both in terms, this is the official rate. This is the poverty rate if unemployment insurance wasn't there. This is the poverty rate if the federal earned income tax credit is included. So the poverty rate goes down because it actually produces wealth. And then this is the line which says that wealth is also generated through the food stamp program because people have more resources that they can use for their livelihood, for their families. So this is just to show what has happened over the 2010 period of time, where you can see that we've had recessions and unemployment and poverty rates have really gone up during the business cycle. So we're out of the worst circumstances of the crisis of 2007, and the poverty rate has now gotten down to below the 15.1% level. But interestingly, unemployment has fallen much faster than the poverty rate has fallen, and that again can be related to the fact that the way the economy is recovering with fewer full-time jobs and more part-time jobs. And the reason it's happening is because employers feel insecure. They don't know what's going to happen. So they're hiring people at 25 and 30 hours a week, which lowers the income that people get paid. It also means that they don't have access to certain benefits like health care. So I know this story sounds really bleak, but I want you to know that I'm an optimist, and I've been studying this for about 30 years, and I still believe you can do good policy, and I have seen good policy done. And I also know that what stops between us having good policy and policy that's inadequate is a lack of education and a lack of courage. So you're here to get education, and I hope that you also get courage, because fighting things like poverty takes courage, and it takes belief that things can be better. But I still believe, so you better believe too. Okay. So let's start the story in the 1960s, because it's a wonderful story, actually. It's a story of people coming together and realizing something needed to be done, and then also the complexity that actually exists that makes it very hard for policies to work. So here we are back in 1960. This was when Molly did her analysis and when she produced her calculation. There were about 40 million people who were in poverty, and poverty rate was 25%. And it went right down along this point right here when we indexed Social Security, and that meant that it was going to be adjusted for inflation, which allowed the elderly population to basically have some degree of economic stability. And I think that's a very prideful statement to make. You can also see that the poverty rate kind of got stuck, right, for a long period of time, and that's because A, no president wants to change it and be the person that has a rise in the poverty rate. But also, remember, we had economic bad times from 1980 to 1990, and this was a good time, the 95 to 2000 period of time. And then you can see just before the crisis that poverty was rising by itself. And remember, this was a time when Bill Clinton led the federal government to a surplus rather than a deficit. And unemployment rates were down at 4.5% and 5%. So in my lifetime, your lifetime, modern time, you can actually have everything align. Okay, so what was going on? Why did this happen? Why did somebody care in the 1960s? There was a lot of things happening at once. You had a mass migration from rural to urban, so cities were being flooded with people who didn't have modern education, didn't have a place to live, maybe came off the farm without a lot of positive health, not very good dentistry, and they flooded the cities, and they flooded the schools, and they flooded the hospitals. And so this was a big problem. These were people that were making much lower incomes, moving to a place where they had no potential for subsistence. At the same time, what was going on in the 1960s? You remember this idea of the Sputnik? Right? That was a great time. It wasn't a great time in the sort of literal sense in a way, but policymakers were sitting around going, you know what? We have to have everyone have a college education because that's the future. The future is a college education. You know, it's technology, it's flying to the moon, right? And so, in fact, that stimulated them to think that people that were poorly educated and didn't live well were underutilized assets. That's a great way to think about it, right? It's about human capital and underperformance and how do we make it better. So the 1960s was an optimistic time, and we experimented a lot with policies, and we actually believed we could fix things. So that all of the rhetoric so Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson carried forth his policy, and the narrative, the stories that people were telling each other was, we can fight poverty and we can win that war. Vietnam War, really bad time. Shift of national resources away from productive assets to unproductive assets. So we stopped building cities and housing and we started building bombs and guns and things like that. And then we had a big social upheaval. And then, completely unexpected, we had an oil crisis, right? That was a drag. That was really bad. We were so not prepared. America was a gas-guzzling society. Every industry that was heavy was completely underperforming and untuned for a shift in a resource that was the most important variable resource, significantly more important than people. So you know what the variable resource, fixed asset is something that you build and it's there, and the variable factors are things like labor and gas and things like that. Well, it went just like this. $4, $8, $16, $32, $64. In a 5-year period of time. No economic system could respond to that. And we didn't. We had massive unemployment. We lost the automobile industry, the steel industry, the rubber industry, the chemistry, the glass industry, you name it. Any heavy industry which employed very large people was decimated in the 1970s. And so we went from a period of hope and almost a guarantee of a job if you got an education of some sort, to a period where even college-educated people couldn't find work. And it was a very, very grim time. There was also more emphasis than ever on the need to have changes in the composition of labor so that the blue-collar workers who came out of the factories didn't have the skills of the emerging industries. So high-tech industries by the late 1970s. By 1978, we were generating large numbers of jobs, even in the Midwest, in what we would come to know as the high technology industries. So Silicon Valley started actually Silicon Valley dates to the beginning of the 20th century, the radio and things like that. But it really takes off after the Second World War with the use of radar. Miniaturization was created for rockets, so the space race, all of that stuff lined up to make something really great. In the 1970s, those things were just beginning. And even at their highest number, it wasn't until the 2000s that those industries produced more than 5 million jobs. The automobile industry produced 10 million jobs. 25% of the American economy was tied to the automobile industry. So, you know, there's nothing you can do when something like that so big happens. The 1980s, of course, comes into existence. We have economic stagnation. The US actually did okay. Other countries like Mexico were so decimated by the financial crisis of the 70s that they literally lost a decade. You can look at the income structure in Mexico and you can see that it was literally flat for an entire decade. But so the US recovered, but we did not recover everywhere, right? So the Midwest was decimated, and we still have very high unemployment. Cities like Detroit is the worst case, but you can go anywhere in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I taught in Pennsylvania for years, and there still are towns that have never recovered. And that led to a lot of social stress, and it led to the need for public policy. But it was a really difficult time, and we didn't respond with the kind of policy that we needed. The 1990s, there was a recovery, and there's a lot of different reasons to explain why that took place. But one of the things that's important is that the rhetoric shifted from recognizing that people had problems where they were, and they had problems because of who they were. And we entered into an era in which the notion of competition, competitiveness, make places competitive, became the narrative that led our policy framework. And so you would go to places and you'd say, we just have to reduce the cost of doing business. Well, when you reduce the cost of doing business, one of the ways you do it is by lowering the number of jobs that you generate, increasing the capital that's involved, but you often talk about the fact that public policy needs to recede, not have any more public policy, actually have less. So that's the context of the American poverty story. So at the very beginning, we recognized poverty was either place-based or person-based, right? It was either the context where somebody was, Appalachia, Mississippi Delta, US-Mexico border, places where there were not many opportunities and there were some serious drags on the economy. And then there were also people that for a whole bunch of reasons had a very difficult time. One in particular is single female-headed households. So that's a part of American poverty that we don't talk a lot about, but it's a very significant portion of the total poverty that we have. In the early 1960s, when the stories were just forming, individuals were very important. There was this guy named Paul Douglas. He happened to be a senator and also had a PhD in economics, very unusual in American politics, and certainly even more unusual today. And basically, he was from Southern Illinois, and his region was an old coal region. And the coal jobs shifted to Appalachia, and he had massive unemployment in the southeastern corner of his state. And he began to realize that his state would not recover if they didn't fix that problem. And so he started a story that led to the first piece of poverty, or first piece of policy to rectify geographic inequality. This is a map that was created. I'm very proud to say I own an original copy of this map. This map was the first map made with a policy target. And it said that all places that were at 1 percentage point or more above the poverty rate, or the unemployment rate, deserved to have some sort of adjustment. And so we created a program that basically targeted infrastructure and physical types of opportunity in individual places to try to raise the productivity and make it possible, not for people to migrate, because remember we already have the problem of people migrating from the farms. The cities weren't ready, so you needed to be able to keep people where they were. The 1960 election. So you all know that John Kennedy died before he really got to carry out his most, what was going to be his most famous policy and proposal, and that was to eradicate poverty. But Lyndon Johnson picked up the issue after Kennedy's death, and he said, which is a very prophetic statement, he says, I liked John Kennedy, but that poverty stuff, he didn't really get it. He didn't actually understand it. He didn't live it, because he was from a very wealthy family. Whereas Lyndon Johnson was from a hardscrabble family in Texas, and he was a teacher before he became a politician, and he knew exactly what poverty was. So he was able to pick up the story and carry it around in a very powerful way that maybe no one else could have done. And he doesn't get as much credit as he should for it, but he was the person who actually created the story that led to the policies that we had in the 60s. So Appalachia was the place in America. That was the image that every American had on a 5 o'clock news station. There's poverty in America, it's white poverty, it's people who are stuck in places with bad industries, no education, poor environments. And these are all original maps, by the way, from the New York Times, so are the images. And what you can see here is, this is this region. It's basically consisted of 13 states. It was about 10% of the national population. And poverty rates were much higher than, in this region than other parts of the country. So an organization was formed called the Appalachian Regional Commission. It was the first regional effort at a national level to try to rectify poverty. So worst pocket of poverty awaits decision on the 5-year program. But Paul Douglas wasn't in Appalachia, and he was the senator that carried the legislation to bring into existence the first agency whose responsibility it was to do something about spatial inequality. And it wasn't long before people recognized that, in fact, America had a lot of places that were poor. So if you looked at the South was way, way more troubled than Appalachia was. And even out here in the West, you had high rates of poverty. And in the north central states, where that was the heartland of American industry, it also had poverty. And that was because of agriculture and the shift out of industries and agriculture, which was basically making people unable to produce income for themselves. It was also a problem of age. So you can see here, I don't know if you can see the numbers. So in the early days, poverty by young people was relatively low. And you saw a lot more poverty by numbers in the working age population and also in the elderly population. By levels of education, less education, higher levels of poverty. And then, of course, America's continuing issue, which is if you're a person of color or ethnicity, your poverty rate is high. The only population in the United States that does not have high poverty rates is Asian Americans, and that is often attributed to their deep and abiding focus on education in the family to the deficit of everything else. And I don't say that negatively, I say it as they really focus on this because they see this as a way for people to make progress. We had poverty on Native American lands. So all of the lands in the West where we moved Native Americans in the 19th century and early 20th century onto reservations, what we did is take them to the Badlands, to lands where there were no resources and very far away from everything else. So Native Americans always had a very difficult time. And we did formulate policy during this period to address it. We had poverty in the resource regions, so where taconite is a beneficiated type of iron ore. So the iron ore was diffuse. They take all the dirt off of it and they crush it up into pieces and they form it into ingots and they send it out by rail. Well, when it was first being extracted, it was very labor intensive, but as it became more industrialized, it had fewer jobs, and so people ended up with unemployment. And this is, these are regions where it's hard to get from one place to another. My suspicions are that the resource regions in Russia are kind of hard to get out of as well, right? Transportation limitations, family ties are very important, and lack of access to alternative work that would pair up with what you already knew. We also had complex relationships that dated back all the way to the plantation economy. So there was one thing to talk about the Mississippi Delta, but it was another thing to talk about the fact that all the way across the southern part, what was called the Black Belt, was basically made up of a lot of little towns that had no major cities. And the reason was because plantations were economies unto themselves. They did not have trade relationships across plantations. They had trade relationships across the ocean. And as a result, no urban infrastructure, no urban fabric formed. So those were areas where also poverty was high. Migrations to the cities in the 1970s gave people opportunities, but they also created serious problems for city mayors, which would come to produce a force of opposition for national poverty policy. Nobody actually predicted that. The White House ignored it. They actually wanted to get rid of the big city mayors. I don't know if you, so we had what were called urban city bosses, political bosses that basically ran politics through benefit streams, right? So it was who you knew, not what you knew. And so the big cities, mayors didn't want to give up control over their territory, even as the federal government was creating policies. And that set forth an antagonism between cities and Congress, which ultimately ended up reducing the public belief in the possibility of poverty policy. Here's Johnson in his famous State of the Union address when he was fighting against the stories that were already emerging about how we should not try to fight poverty. We should just leave that alone and fix the problems in the cities. But he won the policy. He won the policy, but in the end, it wasn't enough. So you have all these people pile into cities. They come from the countryside, or they came looking for industry jobs and there weren't enough. Employers actually played groups off against one another. So they played the white agricultural workers coming from the South who moved to the cities for jobs against the African Americans who also moved to the cities for jobs. And we ended up having riots. You probably have heard of the 1960s riots and the early 1970s riots in American cities. It was a real thing. Cities, people couldn't find work. The work didn't pay. For those of you that, if you ever have a chance, take a class on labor economics. It's always very useful as a planner to understand how the labor economy works. The bottom line is when a bunch of people show up at the same place, what happens to the wage rate? It goes down. So we had all these people all crowding into the same place looking for work. In the absence of anything for them to do, employers were bidding workers against one another. Even unionized factories were bidding workers against one another. And so the wage rates fell even as the pressure for more jobs rose. There was not enough housing. There was not any health care because we didn't have health care policies. And schools and other types of infrastructure were really, really pressed, right? So it was a difficult situation. So the war starts, the second war starts between the mayors and the White House. And Congress can't believe everybody doesn't agree. They're not happy. And who are these city mayors anyway? But in the end, it was really quite crucial that the White House should have made friends with the cities because the financial crisis right around the corner really needed the city mayors to help. And then they were mad. So, poverty program faces a big test. The test is whether or not we can fight a war on poverty and win. We've made some changes in the statistics, but really it's the same map, only it's 5 years later, and you can see poverty rates are higher in the South. And this is because we are just on the verge of having the economic crisis, right? So the poverty rates are rising. This is Bobby Kennedy, John's brother. So there was a fight within the Democratic Party, the Progressive Party and the more conservative part of the Democrats. The Progressive part said, fight the war and win. Don't listen to all these people who don't want to help. And the White House becomes pragmatic and says, look, we're going to lose everything if we don't scale back our opportunities and basically reconfigure what we're doing. So with a fight in the Democratic Party, that takes up all their attention. And it makes it very hard to make any further progress. The cities are burning. So at the same time as we're trying to eradicate poverty, we have this flood of people into cities, and what do you think white Americans do in the presence of African Americans? They leave. They move to the suburbs. And I came from the Midwest. My father was a terrible character when it came to thinking about African Americans. He said terrible things all my life. I'll be totally honest. And that was because he'd been growing up in a situation in which his job was fought against with someone else, right? My father was in competition for work. And so this became sort of the kind of the looming future, right? What were we going to do about this? We also, in the absence of the white population that's now migrated out, what we have is a growing concentration of people that have lower levels of education, a lack of opportunity in terms of jobs, and also really limited social infrastructure to try to make the world a better place for themselves. So the narrative changes, and the nation starts to say, maybe this this war is not going to be one we can win. We have to think about what would be, we say, a rear guard action. How do you retreat? So this is what poverty looked like in the United States in 1970. The dark color makes it, certainly intensifies it. It would be better, for those of you that are interested in design, to have a color that's slightly less extreme. But you can see that the poverty rates, they were really serious, right? In some places, poverty was 100%. That means that every person that lived there was not making an income above the poverty line. But really what you see is that the poverty problem was in the South. The traditional low-income region, the agricultural region, and the region with small places and no city infrastructure. So we start to reframe the narrative in the 1980s. We're in a financial crisis, we have to retreat. What are we going to say? So some people said that the poverty war won, and some people said the war on poverty didn't win. We still had the same geography. This is one of the things about poverty. It is geographically sticky. It's hard to get, this is a mountain belt. It goes like this. Going this way, going east to west or west to east is really pretty difficult. Your roads go like this, north to south. So it's very hard if you don't have infrastructure and you don't have a vehicle to actually be able to get out of the region itself. So the Clinton years. So Bill Clinton was the best thing since sliced bread, as we say, during that time, because he is an internal optimist. And he was also very much a pragmatist. He understood that the situation was bleak. The public was retreating from any belief in the state. If you remember Ronald Reagan, what did Ronald Reagan say? The famous Reagan statement was, we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. So pack up your tent and leave. That was basically what his attitude was. He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. He wasn't the first person to say that, but he did say it loudly, right? So we waited until the 90s for Bill Clinton. And what Bill Clinton said is, I need to reframe the narrative so that people believe that there's some way out of this mess. So his story began to be that we need to make these places competitive. We need to raise the productivity of workers. We need to add capital to their economies. We need to get people to take more personal responsibility. And we didn't have a lot of money, really, in the federal policy. How did we get rid of the deficit? We stopped spending money. That's how you do it, right? It's a surefire way to do it, right? It takes a while, but it actually works. And so he redefined the problem, which was a very smart thing to do, and he did it more than once. But the problem was the same. And so he went into these communities and he said, all we need to do is give you a road out of here, or a bus to ride, or better schools, and that will be it. But actually, that's not it. That's not the answer, actually. Poverty is more complex than that. So this is the same map in 2000. And you can see that this is actually lessened. It's not as intense. And we start to see these places along the upper Midwest, the northern Midwest, as we call it. And we also see along the US-Mexico border. The poverty that's forming here is the result of migration. Immigrants coming into the United States, undocumented, looking for opportunity, because I remember I told you about the lost decade in Mexico. The lost decade kind of dribbled down into the rest of the southern Americas. And you can also see that it differentiated by population. The thing that's really important to note is the place where poverty rates actually were low by comparison was in the traditional industrial heartland. The places where there were good jobs, jobs that had unions, jobs that had occupational ladders, jobs where people could make a living and send their kids to school. So here's the maps of today. And these come out of so all those maps I made, I built a computer tool before there was a computer tool to actually make maps with the census. These are now totally automated. You can go to a place called factfinder.gov and it'll allow you to make maps just like this. And you can use color codes and different categories. So we've made huge progress. And what you can see is that it's clearly lessened, right? less it in terms of its intensity. But remember, all of you, you're also spatial analysts, and many of you work on design subjects. What is the first thing you do when you look at a map? You look at the scale. So the scale here is percent of poverty under age of 18, 42 to 61. So by just a click of the switch, you get a slightly lighter color scheme, and it doesn't look so bad, right? So just keep in mind, maps can lie. They can also tell the truth. Yeah, I know Mark Mominier, famous book he wrote on Maps Can Lie. We still have poverty here. It's less, but it's not gone, and it's also in other places. But interestingly, if you look along the Midwest and the Northeast, the traditional industrial heartland, where middle-class jobs, jobs with pensions, jobs with health care benefits, they have produced an enduring landscape of economic opportunity. So even though we lost millions of jobs there, and many people have migrated out, putting in place the right set of social policies and opportunities, private and public, actually produces a world that's better. So this is the policy, actually, that we know works over a long period of time. So this is just to say, as I kind of conclude, that economic recessions in my lifetime, we have a saying, they're a dime a dozen, okay? They happen all the time. When I was a child, recessions were shocks. You know, the idea that all of a sudden the entire economy went boop, and the unemployment rate went like that wasn't very common, right? It was pretty stable. Second World War, after the Second World War, the 50s and the 60s, we had a period of what they call the golden age of capitalism. That is tarnished, and now we're in a global world. And the ability to respond rapidly to the economic processes that are happening outside is harder. We have to be more clever. We have to work around the sets of circumstances that we currently face. This is the official poverty rate. I'm a few years behind, but you can see that it's just about what it was in the 1970s, 1960s. So we've gone back up. We're at 15%. The child poverty rates in the United States are 20%. So we're at a turning point, actually, as a nation. And the question is, can we get out of the doldrums enough? And can we get policymakers willing to look around and say, there's a lot of clever people here. We probably have some idea about what to do. So where the debate is now is the difference between people and place. The natural thing for a politician to do is put infrastructure in. Why? Because they love to cut ribbons at roads. You know what that is? Like you put a new road in, and then you put a ribbon across the road, and all the people come and they cut the ribbon. It's much harder for a politician to invest in people, and why is that?
Because people are mobile.
That's right, they migrate as soon as they get a college education. And so we have to figure out what it is about the relationships between people and place. We have to figure out how much we have to invest in order to figure out to have people capable of staying, but also wanting to stay. And you know, I would say that we're beginning to learn that in cities, actually. You know, we see a city like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was the brewing capital of the US, that went on, when the brewing industry consolidated and it went from small regional breweries to giant national breweries, the unemployment was massive, and the buildings enshrouded the city, and they have these big hulking buildings. They have been able to reconfigure their economy around water, of all things. They're on the Great Lakes. They had a lot of latent knowledge about how to process water that was associated with the brewing industry. And some clever fellow, actually I know him, his name's Samus White. He's a planner, by the way. And he said, you know, there's something about this place that we've been overlooking. It has to do with one of these assets that we think everyone has, and we too have it, but we're not special. And he said, we're going to be special. And they have spent the last decade building the social relationships and the business relationships and the attraction of capital and the types of firms and the kind of education that the university is producing and all the branding associated with these boutique beers and all these other things. And they've actually made the city that was pretty boring a pretty exciting place, actually, where young people want to stay, and the environment has changed. So it means that there are things we do know as planners, actually. We do know a lot of things. We just have to figure out how we get that outside from underneath our little lamp, right? We have to let other people know that we actually know a lot of things. So I don't think I'm connected to your network, but I want you to know that I have a feeling we have something in common. We have landscapes and complex populations. You have poverty in places. It's just like the poverty I work on all the time. The road between Petersburg and New York is linked to this computer link here. And it shows a story about a road that's totally dysfunctional, can take anything from 8 to 12 hours to pass. Populations along the road, which during the past had reasons to exist or access to opportunities because of the time, because of the type of economy. But now those opportunities are becoming less and less. So your spine of the Appalachian Mountains might be the road between Moscow and Petersburg. So what are you going to tell the politicians? What do they need to do? I look forward to reading about this. So maybe this should be a studio or a project that you all work on. Thanks.